In the autumn of 1885, the Wyoming Territory had lulled itself into a dangerous peace. The winters of 1883 and 1884 had been merciful. Mild snows, occasional thaws in January, temperatures that rarely dropped below -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The ranchers of Black Coulee Valley, a tight-knit community of 14 cattle operations spread across 40 square miles of grassland and buttes, had begun to believe that the worst of winter was behind them. They had let their guard down. They had stopped worrying about the deep cold that could destroy an entire season's breeding stock in a single night of negligence. Jericho Halverson, the former New Bedford whaler turned livestock rancher, knew better. He had spent 12 years at sea, from 1873 to 1885, learning to read weather patterns, wind shifts, and the ancient wisdom of men who made their living in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Now, at age 38, with a 32-year-old wife named Louisa, a young girl and a young boy to feed, and 23 head of cattle, a mix of Texas Longhorn and Shorthorn crosses, Jericho understood one crucial fact that the other ranchers had forgotten. Complacency killed livestock, and complacency, more often than not, killed ranchers too. The herd meant everything. Without those cattle, the Halverson family had nothing. No income, no security, no future west of the Mississippi. On a cold afternoon in late October 1885, Jericho stood in the Black Coulee trading post, a squat log building with a sagging roof and a stove that burned perpetually in the center, and he laid out his plan to anyone who would listen. The trading post owner, a man named Horace Tull, had invited the neighborhood over, all 14 ranchers within a 30-mile radius, for their monthly gathering. These meetings were where information flowed. Cattle prices from Cheyenne, news of rustlers, reports of wolves, whispers about the railroad. It was also where Jericho knew he would find his greatest challenges. Jericho stood near the stove, his frame still lean and rope-muscled from 12 years of climbing rigging and hauling whale carcass, and he spoke directly. He told them about the Portuguese sailors he had worked alongside on the whaling expeditions. These men, he explained, had come from a part of Portugal where winters were mild, where the sea kept temperatures moderate. But they had developed a technique, one refined over centuries, for keeping their food warm and preserved during long voyages. They would dig pits in the ship's hold, bury cast iron ballast weights that had been heated by the galley fire, and cover them with blankets and canvas. A single heated iron weight, properly buried, would radiate heat for 18 to 24 hours, warming anything above it, cassoulets, stews, provisions that needed to stay warm and edible. The principle was simple. Iron, properly heated and insulated, released its thermal energy slowly. The heat diffused upward through earth and cloth and wood. It was reliable. It was tested. It was physics, not luck. Jericho proposed adapting this principle to livestock. He would source a large cast iron vault, 600 pounds, salvaged from a merchant ship that had wrecked in Boston Harbor in 1882. He had already purchased it 3 years ago for $35 and had it shipped west by rail, one of the few pieces of maritime cargo he had brought with him when he abandoned the whaling trade for ranching. He would dig a pit beneath his barn floor, 4 feet deep and 5 feet wide. He would lower the iron vault into the pit, seated on a bed of sand and clay to ensure level settling. He would build a brick chute sealed with mortar and reinforced with scrap iron pipe, leading from the barn's exterior to a slot in the top of the vault. Every morning, before dawn, he would feed glowing coals, perhaps 20 to 30 pounds of hardwood charcoal mixed with anthracite coal, down through that sealed chute. The coals would fall into the vault's interior, where they would burn slowly, radiating heat. The vault's iron walls, 6 inches thick, would absorb and store that heat. As the coals burned down to ash over the course of 18 to 20 hours, the iron vault would grow warm, perhaps 250 to 350 degrees Fahrenheit at its surface. And that warmth would radiate upward through the barn floor, heating the subsoil beneath it. The barn itself, insulated by its roof and walls, would maintain a steady internal temperature of 38 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the air outside dropped to -40 or colder. The math was sound. The principle was proven. The cost was negligible. Jericho estimated the brick chute and iron fittings would cost no more than $1.20. He already owned the iron vault. He had the labor. He had the knowledge. What he did not have was the support of his neighbors. Randall Crawford, the largest rancher in Black Coulee, with 340 head of cattle spread across 2 separate properties, stepped forward before Jericho had even finished explaining the chute's design. Crawford was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered the color of old mahogany. He had come to Wyoming in 1871, before the railroad, when buffalo still roamed the plains. He had built his empire through ruthlessness and luck. He did not believe in innovation. He did not believe in men who had spent their youth chasing whales instead of cattle. "You're going to bury a ship's anchor under your barn, Halverson?" Crawford's voice was heavy with mockery. The other ranchers laughed. They knew Crawford's laugh was permission to laugh. "What's next? Are you going to harness the wind to turn your hay wagon? Are you going to bottle summer and pour it out in January?" More laughter. But Jericho had anticipated Crawford. He had worked on whaling ships with men far more cynical and cunning than any frontier rancher. He had learned that mockery often meant fear. Fear of being left behind. Fear that someone else might succeed with a method you didn't understand. Jericho replied without anger, without defensiveness. He simply asked Crawford a question. "How many head did you lose in the winter of 1871? Crawford's face darkened. The answer was 17. Everyone in the room knew it. It had nearly bankrupted him. "And in the winter of 1880, before the railroad brought regular grain shipments, how many head starved before your hay supplies ran out?" The answer was 12. Jericho continued. "The vault system isn't about comfort. It's about survival margins. If my herd survives a winter that kills yours, I have a genetic advantage. My calves will be stronger. My bloodline will survive when weaker herds collapse, and I'll be able to breed and sell stock while you're rebuilding. That's the mathematics of it, Crawford. You can mock it. But when January comes and the temperature drops to -35 and your cattle are huddling against frozen water troughs, you'll think about this conversation." The room went quiet. Jericho had struck at Crawford's weakness, his past failures, his fear that younger men with new ideas might eclipse him. Crawford said nothing more. He moved to the stove and poured himself whiskey from a flask. That silence was as good as permission. Preston Mahaffey, the bank agent from Cheyenne who came to Black Coulee once a month to collect payments and assess property values, was less easily silenced. Mahaffey was 42, educated. He had spent 2 years at a college in Denver, and he made a habit of explaining things to ranchers as though they were children. "The system is frivolous engineering, Halverson," Mahaffey said. his voice carrying the particular contempt of a man who understood compound interest and quarterly reports. "You're talking about burning $10 to $12 worth of coal every single day just to keep your barn slightly warmer than nature would allow. The economics don't support it." Jericho had anticipated this objection too. "Calculate it another way, Mahaffey. I lose one head of cattle to cold, disease, or starvation. I've lost $350 in breeding potential. That's one animal. Crawford has lost 17 in a single winter. I burn $12 of coal per day for 120 days. That's $1,440 in fuel for the entire winter. But I save 5 or 6 head of cattle by maintaining them at a survivable weight. That's $1,700 in direct value. The system pays for itself in the first winter." Mahaffey's face flushed. He was not accustomed to being corrected by ranchers, especially not by a former whaler. But he had no answer that made mathematical sense. He sat back down. Louisa Halverson, standing near the back of the trading post with 2 other ranchers' wives, caught Jericho's eye and nodded. She had been a school teacher in Boston before she came west, and she had married Jericho after knowing him for only 6 weeks. Her family had said she was mad, but she understood that Jericho was a man who calculated. He did not act on impulse. When he spoke about temperatures and measurements and costs, he spoke with the precision of a man who had spent years taking observations on a moving ship, where every measurement meant the difference between life and death. Not everyone in the trading post was skeptical. Tamsin Locke, a widow who had been ranching alone for the past 8 years, managing 60 head of cattle without a husband and with only one hired hand, approached Jericho after the general discussion had dispersed into smaller conversations. Tamsin was 41 years old, with hands as calloused as any man's, and a directness that came from having made every decision on her own ranch for nearly a decade. "Tell me again about the brick chute," Tamsin said. "I want to understand the sealed part." Jericho explained it in detail. The chute would be built from handmade bricks, the same bricks the community used for chimneys and foundation work. It would be mortared together with clay and sand, reinforced at the external opening with scrap iron pipe salvaged from old mining operations in the valley. The chute would slope slightly downward, about 2 degrees, to ensure that coals and ash wouldn't jam. It would be 7 feet long, running from the exterior barn wall down through the foundation and sealed floor to the iron vault itself. At the bottom, there would be a sliding iron door, one that could be sealed shut with a pin once the coals had been added. This way, no warm air would escape. The coals would burn in a controlled environment. Tamsin nodded slowly. "August Weimer could make that iron door," she said. August Weimer was a German immigrant blacksmith who lived at the northern edge of the valley. He had arrived in Wyoming in 1879 after working in mining operations in Colorado. He was 68 years old, one of the oldest men in the valley, but his hands were still strong and his mind was sharp. "If I ask him to make it, will he?" Jericho said. Yes, he had already spoken to August. The blacksmith was interested in the project. The ironwork was solid, nothing frivolous about it. August would require payment, but not in cash. Jericho had offered trade, a quarter cord of firewood from his cutting operation every month for the winter. August had accepted. Tamsin said, "Then I'm in. I'll help with the excavation. When do we start?" Jericho felt something shift. He now had an ally, a powerful one. A widow managing 60 head alone commanded respect in the valley. If Tamsin believed in the vault system, Others might reconsider their skepticism. Jericho said they would begin in early November, as soon as the autumn work was done. The brandings, the roundups, the final preparations. The ground was still workable in early November, before the hard freeze set in. Once December came, the earth would be too frozen. They had a narrow window of perhaps 4 weeks. The following week, Jericho met with August Weimer at the blacksmith shop, a small stone building with a forge and a chimney that ran constantly in autumn and winter. August was hammering a piece of iron fencing into shape when Jericho arrived. The old German worked without stopping, measuring by eye, striking with precision. When he finished the section, he cooled it in water and turned to Jericho. "The sliding door," August said without preamble. "You need it tight, no gaps. The coals, they will create pressure. Heat expands." Jericho nodded. He had thought about this. 6 inches by 6 inches and a ½ inch thick plate? August considered. Make it 6 inches by 7 and 3/4 inch thick. The hinges, I have good iron salvage from the mining days. I can build hinges that will last 100 years. "Cost?" Jericho asked. "The firewood," August said. 1/4 cord per month, November through February. That is enough. I burn wood and coal in equal measure. 1/4 cord less wood means 1/4 cord less coal I need to buy from the merchant. It was practical barter. August had no interest in cash he didn't need. He wanted fuel. Jericho said yes. August said, "I will have the door ready in 2 weeks, and I will help with the installation. I want to see this work." In the old country, my grandfather had similar ideas. The rich men, the engineers, they laughed at him too, but he was right. Jericho and August spent nearly 2 hours at the forge discussing the specifications. The iron vault would sit in the pit on a bed of sand and clay, leveled to within 1/4 inch across its entire 4-foot base. This was critical. Any tilt would cause uneven heat distribution and potential cracking of the 6-inch walls if thermal stress accumulated on one side. August explained that iron, when heated unevenly, would expand unevenly. The south-facing side of the vault, exposed to more heat from the coals, would want to expand slightly more than the north-facing side. If the vault was tilted, that differential expansion could create stress fractures over time. Therefore, the pit had to be absolutely level. Jericho should use a carpenter's level, not just his eye. August also suggested that the bottom of the pit be compacted very carefully. "You will take a wooden maul," August said, "and you will pound the clay smooth and hard. Each blow, you wait for the dust to settle before the next blow. This takes patience, but the result is a surface that will not shift. A vault sitting on loose earth will settle, and settling means the door seal will fail." August made sketches in the dust on his workbench. He showed Jericho how the coal chute, as it connected to the top of the vault, needed a lip, a raised lip 1 inch high around the coal intake hole. This lip would prevent ash from overflowing out of the vault and into the barn floor space. The lip would be cast as part of the access opening itself. "When you build the chute," August said, "the brick chute, it must slope down to the vault exactly 2 degrees. Not 3 degrees, not 1 degree, 2 degrees. Any steeper, the coals move too fast and create drafts that blow the fire. Any shallower, and the coals stick, and you have to use a poker to push them down. 2 degrees is the angle where they move by gravity alone, slow and steady." Jericho understood. August had thought about every detail. The old German's mind worked like a whaling ship's captain, considering every variable, every point of potential failure. Jericho said, "How will we know the vault is radiating heat properly?" August replied, "We will have to test it, after you install it and seal the chute. But before the winter comes serious, we light a coal fire. We let it burn for 6 hours. Then we put a thermometer on the barn floor above the vault. Then we wait. If the temperature at the barn floor rises to 35 or 40 degrees, while the pit area stays at maybe 60 or 70 degrees, then we know the heat is moving upward properly. If the barn floor stays cold, then something is wrong. Perhaps the seal is broken. Perhaps the vault has a crack we did not see." "What if it does have a crack?" Jericho asked. August was quiet for a moment. "Then you have a 600-pound piece of iron that is useless for this purpose. But I do not think it will crack. I think this iron is good iron. I will inspect it myself when we lower it into the pit. I have an ear that can hear cracks. I will tap the vault with a hammer. If there is a crack, I will hear it sing wrong." It was not a scientific answer, but Jericho had worked on whaling ships long enough to know that the old-timers' techniques often worked better than theoretical science. A man who had spent 60 years around iron would know more about iron than a man who had read about it in a book. Jericho felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the blacksmith's forge. He was assembling something, not just a vault system, but a coalition. Randall Crawford had his size and his history, but Jericho had something older, the logic of survival, and people willing to believe in it. In the first week of November, 1885, the weather turned. The overnight temperatures dropped from 40 degrees to 20. The first frost came early, 2 weeks ahead of the usual cycle. The leaves of the scattered cottonwoods around Black Coulee turned gold and brown almost overnight. The grass began to dry, the cattle grew thicker coats, and Jericho understood that the season would not be mild like 1883 and 1884. This would be a hard winter. The signs were everywhere. The thickness of the cattails in the creek bottoms, the way the geese had left early, the behavior of the deer pushing down from the high country. The ranchers of Black Coulee, who had grown complacent through 2 mild years, began to feel the first stirrings of unease. Reverend Elmer Downs, the Methodist preacher who came to Black Coulee once a month for services and who lived primarily in Cheyenne, happened to arrive at the valley on the very day that Jericho and Tamsin began the excavation. Reverend Downs was 58 years old, with white hair and a voice trained to carry across a crowded church. He saw the work being done, Jericho and Tamsin and the hired hand Micah digging beneath the barn with shovels and a hand-crank auger, and he stopped to watch. "What is this work, Jericho?" the Reverend asked. Jericho explained the vault system again in abbreviated form. The Reverend listened, then said something that would echo through the valley. "It seems to me that you are placing your faith in your own engineering rather than in the providence of God. The Lord protects His creatures. Should we not trust in His wisdom rather than in buried iron?" Jericho had expected this objection. He had been raised Methodist, though he had drifted from the faith during his years at sea. He replied carefully, "I believe the Lord gave me the mind to observe how heat works, and the hands to build something with that knowledge. Surely using those gifts is not a lack of faith. It's an exercise of it." The Reverend considered this. He said no more, but Jericho could see that he remained unconvinced. The preacher was a man of tradition. New ideas troubled him, but Reverend Downs said nothing to actively discourage the work, and that was enough. The excavation took 3 days. The ground beneath the barn was solid clay mixed with decomposed granite, typical for the valley. Jericho and Tamsin worked in shifts with Micah, the hired hand, and two of Tamsin's crew. By the afternoon of the third day, they had a pit that was 5 feet wide, 5 feet long, and 4 feet deep. The bottom was level. The walls were reasonably straight. It was ready for the vault. The cast iron vault itself had been stored in Jericho's equipment shed since he had brought it west from Boston. It was a rectangular structure measuring 4 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet tall. Its walls were indeed 6 inches thick. Its weight, 600 pounds, required planning. Jericho had arranged for a blacksmith's crane borrowed from August's shop. The crane was a simple mechanical device, a wooden frame with a system of pulleys and rope. It could be mounted above the pit. Jericho had spent 2 evenings calculating the mechanical advantage. With a 6-to-1 pulley system, the 600-pound vault could be lifted and lowered by no more than 4 men working in sequence. On the morning that they prepared to lower the vault into the pit, Jericho woke before dawn and made the calculations one more time. The vault weighed 600 pounds. The rope required for a 6-to-1 system could support 2,000 pounds. The crane's wooden frame could bear the load. The pit was ready, everything aligned. As the sun rose over Black Coulee, Jericho and August and Tamsin and Micah and 2 additional hired hands gathered in the barn. The crane was positioned. The rope was threaded through the pulleys. The vault, wrapped in canvas straps to protect its iron surface, was secured to the rope. August gave the signal. The men began to pull. The iron vault hung suspended in the pit on ropes looped through the barn beams, and Jericho Halverson stood knee-deep in the excavated earth, studying the angles, 4 feet down. The pit was now a cathedral of possibility. He could smell the raw loam and the autumn chill seeping in from above. August Weimer stood on the barn floor level, the blacksmith's massive hands gripping the rope, his weathered face studying the vault with the same intensity a captain might study a ship's hull. Tamsin Locke was there too, standing near the pit's edge in her heavy brown coat, having ridden over from her own property 5 miles south. She had come not as a skeptic, but as a believer. Louisa was inside the barn, keeping the young girl and young boy occupied with mending tasks so they would not wander into the pit's danger. The lowering began methodically. The ropes creaked against the iron beam. Jericho guided the vault down with his hands, feeling for any twist or binding. The 600-pound mass descended with agonizing slowness, and August kept tension even on both ropes, his shoulders corded with effort. When the bottom of the vault was 6 inches from the prepared stone bed, Jericho called halt. The vault settled the final distance with a controlled lower, and Tamsin helped slide the flat stones into place beneath it, 3 slate slabs positioned to distribute the weight evenly across the soil compaction below. The vault was now in place. It sat in the 4-foot-deep pit like a buried heart, its cast-iron surface dark and cold, the exterior coated in the rust-orange patina of its years aboard merchant vessels. August descended into the pit with an iron brace Jericho had fashioned from his metalwork, checking the horizontal level against both the length and width of the vault. "Half-inch off," he said, his German accent clipping the word short. They placed thin wedges of slate beneath the eastern edge. August checked again. Gut, perfect now. This vault represented 10 years of salvage calculations in Jericho's mind. He had seen it on the docks in New Bedford in 1882, half buried in barnacles, destined for the scrap melters. It had been used to ballast merchant ships, waded into the deepest holds to keep vessels stable in Atlantic swells. It was built with a thickness of cast iron that would withstand deep pressure and time. The interior chamber measured 32 inches long, 24 inches wide, and 18 inches tall. That was 10,368 cubic inches of enclosed space. More importantly, the vault was double-walled. Between the outer and inner walls, running the full perimeter and across the bottom, was a 2-inch gap. This gap Jericho and August would fill with fire clay mortar, a dense substance that would trap heat within the dead airspace and prevent rapid cooling. Fire clay cost $3 a 100 pounds, and they had purchased exactly 15 pounds for 25 cents. August had mixed it that morning with water to the consistency of thick mud. Now, as the vault settled into its permanent position, Jericho began the meticulous work of packing that fire clay into every gap between the inner and outer walls. He used a narrow iron rod and a small wooden hammer, pressing the material down methodically. This took 2 hours. Louisa brought him water and bread at midday. The young girl came outside to watch, standing at the pit's edge with her hands in her pockets, saying nothing. She understood that her father was building something important. The sealed lid was another matter entirely. The vault's top was a cast iron plate, 5/8 of an inch thick, with 4 iron wing nuts welded at the corners. These wing nuts screwed into threaded shafts that descended from an iron frame Jericho had designed to sit flush with the lid's edge. When all 4 wing nuts were tightened, the seal was absolute. There would be no air gap, no slow leakage of heat. The lid itself had a gasket groove cut into its underside, a channel that ran around the perimeter. Into this groove they pressed a leather gasket material, 1/4-inch thickness, cut from the remnants of a saddle blanket that Louisa had sacrificed. The leather came from her sister's old trunk, pieces too worn for use but still supple enough to compress and seal. August did the leather work himself, shaving the thickness with a sharp knife until each strip fit the groove with perfect tension. He charged nothing additional for this, adding it to the labor they had already agreed upon. The 4 wing nuts alone had taken August 6 hours to forge, working from a bag of salvaged iron hardware and raw metal stock. Jericho had paid him a 1/4 cord of split firewood, approximately 40 cubic feet, enough to heat the blacksmith shop for 3 weeks of winter. Now came the chute. This was the critical innovation, the element that made the entire system functional. The chute was a vertical shaft, 4 inches in diameter, running from a sealed opening in the barn floor directly down to the vault's top hatch. It needed to be constructed in a way that channeled hot coals downward without allowing heat to escape laterally. Jericho and August began with a frame of bent iron straps, each 1/2 inch wide and 1/4 inch thick, forming a cylinder. August had bent these on his anvil, crimping the edges so they overlapped slightly and could be riveted together. The cylinder was 5 feet long, which accounted for the 4 feet of pit depth, plus an additional foot of above-floor installation. Inside this iron frame, they began laying fire bricks. These were specialized bricks, smaller than building bricks, measuring 6 inches long, 3 inches wide, and 2 inches thick. Fire bricks were essential because they could withstand direct contact with hot coals and flame without breaking down. The cost for 30 fire bricks was 45 cents. The bricks were laid in a spiral pattern around the interior of the iron cylinder, each one mortared in place with a clay mortar that Louisa had mixed according to her notes from an old agricultural journal. The spiral was crucial. It ensured that coals falling down the chute would tumble gradually rather than drop freely, maintaining contact with the heated brick surfaces and transferring their warmth to the chute walls. Those walls, in turn, would radiate heat directly into the vault below. This 5-foot-long section of fire brick spiral work took 23 hours to complete. August and Jericho worked in shifts. The bricklaying required patience and precision. Each brick had to be mortared firmly. Any gap would allow coals to bypass the heating surfaces and enter the vault chamber unburned. The work continued over 4 days, November 15th through November 18th. On November 18th, the chute was finally complete, the spiral ascending in perfect symmetry, an engineering marvel that rose from the vault's top hatch upward toward the barn floor. At the vault end, the chute connected to a reinforced iron flange that was bolted directly to the vault's lid with 8 lag bolts, each half an inch in diameter. The connection had to be airtight. Jericho had used tin solder to seal around each bolt hole, ensuring that heat entering the chute could only travel downward into the vault and could not escape through any other pathway. At the barn floor end, the chute passed through a sealed opening that Jericho had prepared by cutting a 5-inch square hole in the barn's wooden floor, then reinforcing the edges with a cast iron collar. The collar was bolted to the floor beams from underneath, creating a frame that was independently stable. The chute passed through this collar with 1 inch of clearance on all sides. The gap between the chute and the collar was filled with clay mortar and sealed further with another leather gasket that surrounded the chute's exterior just below the floor surface. Above this seal, the floor opening was closed with a hinged iron plate, measuring 8 inches square, covered with a knob of iron that Jericho could grip with his fingers. This was the feed opening. When Jericho needed to add coals, he would lift this hinged plate, drop the hot coals through the 4-inch diameter chute, and close it again. The iron plate fit tightly enough that minimal heat escaped when it was closed. Below the vault, at the bottom of the chute, was an iron ash drawer. This was a small box, 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, 4 inches deep, positioned directly beneath the chute's lowest point. The ash drawer was accessed from outside the barn. Jericho had cut a small opening in the foundation, positioned the ash drawer so its face was flush with the exterior wall, and sealed the edges with clay mortar. Each morning, before he fed fresh coals into the chute, he would open the ash drawer from outside and clean out the previous day's accumulation of ash. This ash itself was not wasted. He would spread it on the barn floor during winter to provide traction, and in spring, scatter it on the fields as mineral supplement. The ash was proof of the system's efficiency. If coals were burning completely, the ash volume would be minimal. If the combustion was incomplete, ash would accumulate heavily, indicating that coals were cooling before they could be fully consumed. The radiant bed surrounding the vault was equally important. The vault did not sit in bare earth. Instead, it was surrounded by a 3-foot-wide bed of river stones and packed sand. Jericho had spent 3 days in October collecting stones from the creek that ran 2 miles south of his property. He filled 2 wagons with smooth stones, each one fist-sized, and transported them back. August helped him place these stones in a careful pattern around all sides and beneath the vault. The stones created a heat retention zone. The intense heat radiating from the vault would warm these stones. The stones would then continue radiating that warmth for hours after the coals had cooled, extending the thermal benefit of each feeding. The sand, when packed between and around the stones, acted as an insulator, slowing heat loss to the surrounding earth. This bed was 3 feet wide in all directions, creating a thermal mass of approximately 1,200 pounds of stone and sand. The cost for this material was zero. The stone was free, collected from the creek. The sand was taken from the barn's existing tool storage area. Labor to assemble the bed had taken 14 hours over 2 days. Now, the construction reached its critical test phase. On November 22nd, at dawn, Jericho filled the vault with hot coals. He gathered these coals from the barn's blacksmith fire, where August had banked a fire the previous evening, specifically to generate a good bed of coals. Using a long iron shovel, Jericho pushed approximately 8 pounds of glowing coals, pieces ranging from the size of a fist to the size of an apple, down the chute. The coals tumbled through the spiral brick-lined shaft, contacting the heated brick surfaces, transferring their thermal energy as they descended. They emerged into the vault's interior chamber and settled at the bottom, continuing to glow faintly. Then Jericho lowered and sealed the vault's lid with the 4 wing nuts, tightening each one firmly. He closed the barn floor's hinged feed opening and secured it with a bolt. The vault was now sealed. The heat was trapped. At noon, Louisa measured the barn floor temperature directly above the vault. She used a thermometer that the banker Preston Mahaffey had lent her reluctantly, as if lending it was an admission that he might have been wrong to mock the project. The temperature above the vault was 44 degrees Fahrenheit. The outside air temperature that day was 34 degrees. There was a 10-degree difference already. By 6 p.m. that same day, the floor temperature had climbed to 46 degrees. The outside temperature remained at 34 degrees. The gap was now 12 degrees. By dawn the following day, November 23rd, the outside temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and the barn floor temperature was still 41 degrees. This was extraordinary. A single feeding of 8 pounds of coals, burned in a sealed chamber 4 feet underground, had produced 12 hours of measurable heat rise in the barn floor above, and had retained enough heat energy that even as the outside temperature dropped by 22 degrees, the barn temperature fell only 5 degrees. Louisa recorded these numbers in her journal with a quiet hand. She had begun keeping these records at Jericho's suggestion, noting the time of each feeding, the weight of coals used, the outside temperature, the wind direction, and the barn floor temperature measured at regular intervals. This data would be the proof that the system worked. It would be more valuable than any conversation, any visual observation, any hand placed on the warm floor. The data would be irrefutable. Randall Crawford arrived on November 19th, midway through the final stages of construction. He rode up on his quarter horse, a man of 54 years with the weathered face of someone who had survived 2 decades of Western ranching. Crawford owned 340 head of cattle, the largest herd in Black Coulee Valley, and he had invested in all the conventional methods for winter protection: large barns, deep straw bedding, and hay reserves calculated down to the pound. He had spent a small fortune on conventional solutions. He had also spent considerable effort mocking Jericho's vault project. He called it frivolous. He called it a waste of salvage materials that could have been sold for scrap. He had declared loudly in the saloon in town that no mere blacksmith's contraption could outperform the time-tested methods of good barn construction and adequate hay reserves. Now Crawford stood in the barn, watching August and Jericho complete the final ceiling work on the chute. He said nothing. Jericho invited him to place his bare hand on the barn floor, 5 feet away from the vault's location. "Here," Jericho said. And here, he indicated two spots, one above the vault, one where the stone and sand radiant bed extended. The barn was cold. It was November, and the wind cut through gaps in the boards. Crawford's face was reddened from the cold of the ride. He removed his glove and placed his bare hand on the floor directly above the vault. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Crawford was not a man given to dramatic expression, but his eyes widened slightly and his jaw tightened. He kept his hand there for nearly a minute, feeling the warmth. Then he removed his hand and looked at Jericho. "How long does it last?" he asked. "That's what we're measuring," Jericho said. "So far, from a single 8-pound loading, we're seeing 12 hours of measurable floor temperature elevation. We'll know more as the cold deepens." Crawford nodded slowly. He did not apologize. He did not admit error, but he asked to watch the first formal test, and Jericho granted the request. Crawford was there on November 22nd when the coals were fed, and again on November 23rd when Louisa recorded the dawn temperature. He watched her write the numbers in her journal. He did not comment. But when he left that afternoon, something had shifted in his demeanor. He was quieter than usual. He looked genuinely uncertain for the first time since Jericho had known him. Reverend Elmer Downs remained unmoved by engineering or data. The Reverend was late 50-something, a man who had established the valley's only church and delivered sermons with absolute conviction. When he heard about the vault project, he had declared it an act of vanity. He had said that it placed faith in mechanical means rather than in the natural order and divine providence. He had suggested, with pointed language in his Sunday sermon, that man's attempt to override the winter through earthly cleverness was an affront to the natural hierarchy. A proper man accepted winter as it came. A proper man worked within nature's strictures, not against them. A proper woman bore the hardship of cold as her Christian duty. Jericho had not argued. Argument with Reverend Downs was futile. The Reverend had been in the valley longer than anyone, had married 3 couples, buried 4 children, and had never been contradicted in a matter of theology or morality. When the vault tests began to show results, Jericho half expected the Reverend to intensify his criticism. Instead, the Reverend had stopped mentioning the vault entirely. He did not visit. He did not inquire about the numbers, but he did reduce his volume on Sunday sermons about the virtue of suffering. Tamsin Locke, by contrast, was energized by the results. Tamsin was early 40, a widow for 8 years, and operated her own ranch with 60 head of cattle and help from 2 hired men. When she visited in late November to observe the vault's performance, she spent 3 hours examining every detail of the construction. She had August explain the fire brick work. She had Jericho explain the radiant bed placement. She had Louisa show her the temperature journal. By the time she left, she had made a decision. Tamsin would build her own vault system, but she faced a problem. The salvaged iron that had made Jericho's vault possible was not available to her. She had no connections to the dock trade. She had no cast iron ballast vault lying unused on a scrap heap. What she could do was commission a new one. She approached August Weimer with a proposition. Could he forge a vault from scrap? Not as large as Jericho's, perhaps, but similar in design and principle. August thought it through. He had access to salvaged iron, ship fittings, old machinery parts, and raw iron stock. He could forge a vault. It would require work. He estimated 24 hours of his own labor, plus the cost of materials. The cost would be $4.80. Tamsin agreed immediately. She contracted August on November 25th, and he began the work the following week. The second vault would not be complete until late December, but Tamsin's commitment to the project was absolute. News of her decision spread through the valley. If Tamsin Locke, a widow, a practical businesswoman, a woman not given to frivolous expense, was building her own vault, then perhaps Jericho's engineering had merit after all. Preston Mahaffey, the bank agent, began to recalculate the economics. A single feeding of 8 pounds of coals producing 12 hours of temperature elevation meant that a winter of 150 days would require approximately 450 pounds of coal equivalent, assuming similar feeding patterns. The cost of firewood was approximately $2 a cord, and a cord yielded roughly 8,000 pounds of burnable material when well seasoned. A rough calculation suggested that thermal maintaining firewood for a single winter would cost approximately $1.10 in materials, plus the labor of daily feeding. This was negligible compared to Jericho's original investment of $1.20 in materials for vault construction. After 10 years, accounting for inflation and increased fuel costs, the vault would have paid for itself and begun accumulating actual savings. Mahaffey did not announce this calculation publicly, but he began asking questions about the vault's design. He asked permission to visit, and Jericho granted it. He examined the numbers in Louisa's journal with the careful eye of a man trained to assess financial viability. He did not commit to building his own vault. Mahaffey was not a man inclined to take financial risks, but he acknowledged that the mathematics were sound. Early December brought the first serious cold snap. On December 3rd, the outside temperature dropped to -18 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the kind of cold that stopped normal livestock operations. Jericho had fed the vault with 15 pounds of coals that morning, increasing the amount as the temperatures fell and the thermal demand increased. By mid-afternoon, as the temperature continued to drop, Jericho added another 10 pounds of coals. His barn floor, measured above the vault, stood at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside the barn, in the exposed paddocks where Randall Crawford's cattle huddled against the cold, the temperature was -18. Inside Jericho's barn, where the vault's radiant heat maintained the floor temperature, the cattle were calm. They stood in relative comfort, their breathing normal, their body heat not desperately burned in survival metabolism. They were alive and well. Outside in Crawford's holdings, 40 miles of cattle operation away, Crawford's cattle were showing signs of stress. They were crowded into smaller shelters. Some of the younger animals would not survive if this cold lasted more than a few days. Jericho did not visit Crawford's property. Jericho was not a man inclined to gloat. But word spread through the valley about the contrast. Jericho's cattle were comfortable in -18. Crawford's were suffering. Randall Crawford visited on December 5th in mid-afternoon after a morning spent assessing his own herd's condition. He was grimmer than before. He asked to see Louisa's journal. Louisa brought it out. 12 days of recorded observations, November 22nd through December 5th. Each entry showed the outside temperature, the barn floor temperature, the wind direction, and notes about coal consumption. The data was irrefutable. Crawford studied the numbers without speaking. Then he asked a direct question. "Can you build another one for my property?" Jericho had not expected this. He said carefully, "The salvage vault is unique. August could forge another. The cost would be significant." How significant? Jericho did not know. $5, perhaps. more if he has to source specialized materials. Crawford nodded slowly. "Do it," he said. "I'll pay, and I want my system operational by December 15th. Jericho knew this was not realistic. There was not enough time. "Randall," he said carefully, "the construction takes weeks. Even if August begins immediately, there is not enough time to complete a vault and test it before the worst cold arrives." Crawford's face hardened. "Then I lose my herd?" "Possibly some animals," Jericho said. "Your hay reserves are good, your barns are adequate. You may lose a few head, but your core herd should survive." "Should," Crawford repeated bitterly. "Not a guarantee." "No," Jericho agreed. "Nothing is guaranteed." Crawford left that afternoon, and Jericho heard later that he had sent a representative to contact August about beginning forge work on a vault for Crawford's property. Even if it could not be completed before the worst cold arrived, it would be valuable for the remainder of winter. The month of December progressed. Jericho's system, now proven through 2 weeks of successful operation, settled into a routine. Each morning, before dawn, he would open the ash drawer and clean out the accumulated ash from the previous day's burn. This took 10 minutes. Then he would gather the day's coal load, the amount varying between 12 and 20 pounds, depending on the outside temperature and the wind conditions. He would fill the chute using the hinged feed opening and seal the vault. Louisa would measure the barn floor temperature 4 hours after feeding, at midday, at 6 p.m., and at dawn the following day. She would record the outside temperature, wind direction, and any observations about the cattle's condition. She kept meticulous notes. By December 10th, Louisa's journal contained 20 days of observations. The data showed that floor temperatures remained between 38 and 48 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of outside conditions. This 8 to 10 degree temperature envelope, significantly warmer than the ambient air, was sufficient to maintain cattle comfort and dramatically reduce metabolic stress. The young girl and the young boy had become accustomed to the vault routine. The young girl often accompanied her father to observe the ash drawer cleaning. The young boy helped gather firewood for the coal burn. They understood, in the way that children understand practical work, that the vault was the heart of the winter operation. Without it, the animals would suffer. Reverend Downs delivered a sermon on December 8th that surprised many in the congregation. He spoke about the virtue of stewardship, the proper care of creatures entrusted to man's protection. He did not mention the vault by name, but the message was unmistakable. A man who used wisdom and careful engineering to ensure that animals under his care were protected from extreme hardship was engaged in stewardship, not vanity. The Reverend had reconciled himself to mechanical innovation. As December deepened, the broader implications of Jericho's vault became clear. The system worked. It was reproducible. Other ranchers, Tamsin Locke first, then Randall Crawford, then 2 smaller operators in the northern reaches of the valley, had begun either constructing their own vaults or commissioning August Weimer to forge them. The innovation was spreading. The cost was reasonable. The engineering was sound. A single salvaged iron vault, costing $1.20 in additional materials, providing thermal protection through winter, protecting livestock worth hundreds of dollars, was an obvious advantage. The only question was how quickly other operations could adopt the system before the worst of winter arrived. December 18th brought news from Cheyenne. The weather office there had received signals about a major cold system moving down from Canada. Reports suggested temperatures could drop below -40 degrees. Reports suggested the system could stall over the Rocky Mountain region for as long as 2 weeks. This was the worst-case scenario. This was the kind of sustained, extreme cold that could decimate unprotected herds. Jericho heard the news from Preston Mahaffey, who had received a telegram at the bank. The bank agent had immediately ridden out to Jericho's property to warn him. "You will want to increase your coal reserves," Mahaffey had said. "This will test everything." Jericho had nodded. He had already begun increasing his firewood reserves in preparation for the deep cold. He doubled the wood piles along the barn's east wall. He recruited August and several other ranch hands to split additional cords. By December 20th, he had accumulated 6 full cords of well-seasoned firewood, more than double his normal winter reserve. This was enough wood to feed the vault heavily through a 2-week cold snap. Randall Crawford also increased his reserves, though his vault was still not complete. Crawford was operating with faith alone, faith that Jericho's system would be reproducible, that the completion could happen before the worst cold arrived, that the investment would save his herd. August Weimer worked late into the short December days, his hammer ringing in the smithy, forging the second vault for Crawford's property. The work would be complete by December 23rd. Installation would take 3 more days. The vault would be operational on December 26th, 2 days before the major cold system was expected to arrive. It would be close. The entire valley was poised on the edge of a test. The old way, dependence on hay, conventional barns, and the luck of survival, was about to be contrasted against the new way, Jericho's thermal engineering. Which cattle would survive minus 40 degrees intact? Which herds would lose animals? Which methods would prove superior? The stakes were clear. The temperatures would not lie. The animals would not lie. The winter would render its final judgment on innovation versus tradition. Jericho stood in his barn on December 21st, his hand on the warm barn floor, feeling the radiant heat from the vault far below. This was his life's gamble made manifest. Everything he had brought from his years in whaling, the knowledge of pressure and containment, the understanding of how to survive in hostile environments, the discipline of precise work and careful planning, was now embodied in a 600-pound cast-iron vault buried 4 feet beneath the barn. When the temperature dropped to minus 43 degrees, when the Canadian cold gripped the valley with absolute force, when ranchers across Black Coulee faced the harsh mathematics of livestock survival, Jericho's thermal vault would reveal its true value. The test was coming. The test was almost here. Everything was ready. The cold came the way winter comes to the high frontier, not with warning, but with arrival. On the morning of January 9th, 1886, the thermometer at the Black Coulee trading post read minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sky was the color of old tin. Jericho Halverson stood in the doorway of his barn before dawn, his breath hanging in the air like smoke, watching the darkness. The wind was already picking up from the north. He knew what was coming. He had felt it in his bones during the last week of December, that particular pressure that whalers understood. The atmosphere was holding something vast and cold at arm's length, and when it finally broke through, it would reshape everything in its path. He had prepared for this moment for 2 months. His 600-pound cast-iron vault, buried 4 feet beneath the barn floor, had been tested and proven. Now it would be tested by something no engineered system had yet faced: a full continental blizzard crossing the high plains. At 5 in the morning on January 9th, Jericho went to the coal bin he kept in the small room adjacent to the barn. the room where he maintained his hopper and feed chute. He selected the heaviest, most heat-dense coals from the winter store, the ones he had saved for exactly this scenario. 12 pieces, each the size of a man's fist, all of them hard anthracite that would burn with steady, reliable heat for the full daylight hours. He placed them carefully into the cast-iron feed hopper he had fabricated, sealed it with a flat iron lid that had been fitted with a gasket of braided flax, and using the mechanical lever system he had built into the chute wall, he lowered the hopper down the brick-lined shaft that descended through the barn floor. The sound it made was the sound of industrial purpose. Metal on metal, the grinding of pulleys, the heavy, deliberate movement of something that had been engineered to last. 14 pounds of coals went down into the vault chamber below. By the time Louisa brought him breakfast at 6 in the morning, hot coffee and bread with rendered fat, the barn floor was already warm to the touch. Jericho measured it with a long glass thermometer he had borrowed from the general store in Cheyenne, 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was -22. By January 11th, the temperature had dropped to -31 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind had reached 20 miles per hour from the north and northwest, carrying with it the particular kind of fine snow that worked its way into every gap and seam, every space between boards and around door frames. The valley had disappeared. You could not see across the main road from the trading post to the church. Visibility was maybe 30 feet on the best moments, and then the wind would shift, and it would narrow to 10 feet, 15 feet, the world contracting down to the immediate catastrophe of white. The ranchers who had built only the most basic shelter, open corrals with some windbreaks of brushwood and slats, had made a terrible miscalculation. Randall Crawford, whose 340-head operation occupied the largest spread in Black Coulee, had been skeptical of Jericho's vault system. Crawford was a man of the old ways, a cattleman who believed that proper breeding, good stock, and the law of survival did the work that sentimentality and engineering could not. His animals were sturdy. They would endure. That was what he had said in early December, when Jericho had invited him to see the system in action during the cold snap. Crawford had looked at the buried vault, at the warm barn floor, at Jericho's comfortable cattle lying on the warm ground, and had smiled in that particular way men smile when they are humoring a fool. On the morning of January 11th, as the temperature dropped and the wind intensified, Crawford's calculations began to shift. By the end of the second day of the blizzard, January 10th going into January 11th, Crawford had lost 23 head of cattle, all of them younger animals, the ones least able to withstand the combination of cold, wind, and the exhaustion that came from standing in drifts that reached their bellies. The herd kept moving, seeking the relative shelter of the ridge on the western boundary of his property, but there was no rest, no warmth, nothing but the progressive failure of flesh and blood in temperatures that human beings could not survive without shelter. By January 13th, when the thermometer at the trading post bottomed out at -38 degrees Fahrenheit, Crawford's losses had climbed to 46 head. The wind, which had started at 20 miles per hour, had increased to 30 miles per hour, gusting to 40 and beyond. The snow was no longer falling so much as blowing horizontally, accumulating in drifts that buried fences and made the landscape into something otherworldly and treacherous. Jericho's routine did not change. Each morning, before dawn, he came to the coal bin. Each morning, he selected the densest, most heat-rich pieces, 14 pounds, measured precisely. He had become methodical in a way that spoke to his years as a whaler, where precision and routine were often the difference between survival and disaster on the open ocean. He fed the vault. He measured the floor temperature. By January 13th, the barn floor held steady at 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside that space, the 23 cattle and 8 horses of his breeding stock lay on the warm floor, their bodies relaxed, their breathing steady. The young girl and young boy slept in the tack room above the barn, a space that was heated indirectly by the warmth rising from below. Not hot, but warm enough that they could sleep without the kind of shivering that burned up a human body's reserves. Louisa, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, continued her observation log, her handwriting precise despite the cold that seeped through even the insulted spaces where she worked. She wrote the temperatures, the time of day, the behavior of the animals, the color of the sky, what little of it she could see through the small window near her work table. These observations, which had begun as an amusement in November, had become a record of something profound, proof that engineering could meet nature on nature's own terms and hold the line. On January 15th, the date was marked by a particular and terrible turning point. The temperature that morning, when Jericho checked the thermometer on the external wall of the barn, read -43 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was gusting to 40 miles per hour, sustained at 30. These were the conditions that, historically, had broken men and herds across the Western Territories. Stories came down through the decades of the Great Winters, 1844, 1856, 1862, when entire herds had frozen where they stood, when ranches had been abandoned, when the death toll had risen high enough that the survivors spoke of it only with the particular tone of voice that comes when describing catastrophe. And yet Jericho went through his routine. He selected 14 pounds of coal. He fed the vault. He descended into the barn and placed his thermometer against the floor. Louisa watched. She had taken to coming with him on the coldest mornings, not to help. There was nothing for her to do, but to witness. The thermometer read 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the world was -43. The difference was 85 degrees. Louisa wrote it down in her log. She wrote the time, 5:47 in the morning. She wrote the external temperature from the wall thermometer. She wrote one sentence: "The vault holds." It was the most significant sentence she would ever write, though she could not have known it at that moment. By January 15th, Randall Crawford had lost 112 cattle. His herd was dying in clusters, the animals seeking shelter that did not exist, standing in drifts with their faces to the wind, waiting for a warmth that would never come. Crawford himself had stopped counting after the first 100. He sat in his house, a man destroyed by the winter and by the knowledge that he had made a choice that was killing his livelihood. On that same morning of January 15th, August Weimer, the German blacksmith, was still finishing the last welds on Tamsin Locke's vault system. He worked in his shop in Black Coulee, a stone structure built by its previous owner to survive exactly this kind of weather, with walls 2 feet thick and a forge in the center that burned hot enough to keep the space warm. He was a meticulous craftsman. The work could not be rushed, and yet the blizzard was upon them, and Tamsin Locke's 60 head of cattle had no shelter with proper ground heat. On the morning of January 15th, as Jericho prepared his daily feed of coal, Tamsin rode across the valley, a ride that was dangerous, visibility near zero, the horse picking its way through drifts, and asked if Jericho could shelter her herd. Jericho had already designed a solution to this possibility. He had built a secondary chute system that ran parallel to the primary one, extending beneath the floor of an adjacent barn wing that he had renovated in early December. The system was exactly like the main vault, smaller in scale, maybe 300 pounds of cast iron instead of 600, but engineered on the same principle. He could activate this secondary system with no impact on the comfort of his own animals. He told Tamsin that he could shelter her cattle, and would. She did not need to lose a single animal to the blizzard. Tamsin began to weep, not from gratitude, though that was part of it, but from the profound relief that comes when someone has been standing on the edge of financial ruin and suddenly finds solid ground. Over the course of January 15th and 16th, in a process that was dangerous and exhausting, Jericho and Louisa helped Tamsin and her hands move 60 head of cattle from the open range into the barn wing. The animals were thin and stressed from 3 days of the blizzard, but they were alive. Once they were inside and the barn doors were sealed, they descended into the same warmth that Jericho's own herd was experiencing. By the time the blizzard reached its absolute peak on January 17th, the temperature briefly dropping to -43 in the afternoon, Tamsin's cattle were lying on a floor that held 40 degrees Fahrenheit, their bodies relaxed, their breathing steady, undamaged. They had survived catastrophe by virtue of engineering and generosity. On January 17th, when the wind finally began to shift and the leading edge of the storm started to move through and past the valley, Randall Crawford had lost 218 cattle. He had started the blizzard with 340 head. He ended it with 122 surviving animals. That was a loss of 64%. His breeding program, which he had built over 15 years, was essentially destroyed. The genetics he had selected for, the bloodlines he had cultivated, the animals he had named and known individually, most of them were dead. In the larger Black Coulee Valley, the casualty numbers were almost incomprehensible. The Weaver Ranch, which had 120 head and had just invested $3,200 in improvements based on Preston Mahaffey's financing, lost 78 animals, a 65% loss. The Fitch family, with 140 head and an operation that had been marginally profitable for 8 years, lost 89 cattle. The Pennington Ranch, the smallest operation in the valley with only 90 head, lost 52. Across the entire Black Coulee Valley, the blizzard claimed more than 600 head of cattle in 7 days. At the prices cattle were commanding in 1886, roughly $18 to $20 per head for good stock, the valley had lost something in the range of $12,000 to $14,000 in livestock value. For a community that had taken 3 years to raise that kind of capital, it was an extinction-level event. And yet, in the barn that belonged to Jericho Halverson, 31 cattle from his own herd lay warm and comfortable. In the adjacent wing, another 60 head, Tamsin's animals, were equally warm and equally safe. 0 losses across both operations. When Randall Crawford rode to Jericho's barn on January 19th, 3 days after the blizzard had passed through the valley, he was a different man from the one who had smiled indulgently in December. He was thinner. His face had taken on a particular kind of gauntness that came from stress and sleeplessness. He rode up to the barn door, dismounted with visible effort, and asked if he could see the vault system. Jericho showed him. They descended into the cool barn. The weather had moderated to -8 degrees Fahrenheit, and Jericho had temporarily stopped feeding coal to the vault while he assessed the structural integrity and the condition of the animals. The barn floor was warm to the touch. Jericho explained how it worked. He showed Crawford the cast-iron vault itself, visible through an access door he had built into the barn foundation. He explained the principle: thermal mass, insulation, a small, consistent heat source that could sustain a large, stable temperature differential. He showed Crawford his measurements from the blizzard days. On January 15th, minus 43 degrees outside, 42 degrees inside. The math was simple. The outcome was inevitable. When Randall Crawford finally spoke, his voice was quiet. He said, "I was wrong." Jericho did not gloat. He did not say, "I told you so." Instead, he showed Crawford the plans he had already drawn up for a system of Crawford's own. He explained the materials needed. He said he would help supervise the construction. He said that every rancher in the valley who wanted to build a vault system could do so, and he would guide them through it. The material cost would be minimal, in the range of $1 or $2 for the cast iron, depending on the size of the vault and the animals it needed to shelter. Labor was the larger investment, but labor was something that ranchers could provide for one another. By mutual aid, the cost became manageable. Within a week, Preston Mahaffey, the bank agent, returned to Cheyenne to report on the blizzard's impact. What he reported was this: that a single rancher named Jericho Halverson had developed a system of thermal engineering that had prevented catastrophic losses on his operation and, by extension, on the operation of Tamsin Lock. Mahaffey had initially dismissed Jericho's work as frivolous and impractical. He now understood that this frivolous engineering was the only thing standing between the Black Coulee Valley and complete economic collapse. The bank, he reported to his supervisors in Cheyenne, should consider it a strategic priority to finance the construction of vault systems across the region. Within 3 weeks, the bank had offered Jericho a loan of $400 to help finance the construction of vault systems on ranches that wanted them. The terms were favorable: 2% annual interest, 10-year repayment, with the understanding that the bank would be paid back from the livestock that the ranchers saved through the use of the vault systems. It was a calculation based on pure mathematics. The blizzard had demonstrated it. On the first Sunday in February, Reverend Elmer Downs, who had called Jericho's system an indulgence and a vanity in December, preached a sermon in the Black Coulee Church on the subject of humility. He spoke about the danger of dismissing wisdom simply because it came from an unexpected source. He spoke about the difference between pride and prudence. He did not mention Jericho by name, but every person in the church understood exactly who he was talking about. The Reverend's voice was firm, and his words were clear. He said that a man who would not listen to knowledge that could save his life was a man who had turned his back on God's will. He said that the willingness to learn, to adapt, to accept that one had been wrong, that was a form of grace. By March 1886, Jericho had overseen the construction of 9 complete vault systems. August Weimer, the German blacksmith, had completed the ironwork for all of them. The total material cost for these 9 systems, cast iron, gaskets, ceiling materials, came to $42. 9 ranches that had been on the edge of ruin after the blizzard were now equipped with the kind of infrastructure that could withstand the next catastrophic winter. Every system was built to Jericho's specifications. Every system used cast iron vaults scaled to the size of the operation. Every system included the same basic principles: thermal mass, insulation through burial, a consistent heat source, and measurement. By the autumn of 1887, when the even more severe blizzard, what would come to be known historically as the Great Die-Up, swept across the northern plains and killed an estimated 70% of the cattle in Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakota territories. Black Coulee suffered less than 5% livestock losses. 23 ranches in the valley and in the neighboring settlements had vault systems installed. The network had expanded beyond the initial 9. Word had spread. Jericho received letters from ranchers in Montana. He received inquiries from Colorado. A rancher in Alberta requested the specifications and the contact information for August Weimer so that he could have a vault system constructed in Canada. The economic impact was extraordinary. In $1887, the vault systems that Jericho had designed and overseen had prevented the loss of approximately 4,000 head of cattle across the region. At the market prices of the time, roughly $85 per head for prime breeding stock, the regional livestock that had been saved amounted to approximately $340,000. That figure exceeded the total annual income of every person in the Black Coulee Valley combined. That figure meant the difference between communities that would fail and communities that would endure. That figure meant something more profound. It meant that engineering, applied with care and precision and generosity, could reshape the boundary between survival and catastrophe. In the years that followed, Jericho Halverson would become known as the man who had saved the frontier. The story would grow in the telling, as frontier stories do. By 1890, some versions had him inventing the system from scratch in a single winter. Some versions had him traveling across 3 territories to oversee the installation of systems. Some versions suggested that he had single-handedly prevented the Great Die-Up from being as catastrophic as it otherwise would have been. The truth was more modest and more profound. He had observed a problem. He had applied the knowledge he possessed, knowledge from his years at sea, knowledge from observation and measurement, knowledge from being willing to think differently about an old challenge. And he had shared that knowledge freely with people who needed it. His wife Louisa kept the records. She continued her logs. She continued to measure temperatures and document outcomes. In 1888, she published a technical paper in the Cheyenne Daily Leader titled Thermal Management in Rural Agriculture, a Practical System for Livestock Protection in Extreme Cold. The paper was republished in a livestock magazine in St. Louis. It was the first published technical documentation of the vault system. Louisa received no payment for it. She did it because the data belonged to the community, and the community deserved to have accurate information about something that had saved their lives. The young girl who had slept in the tack room above the vault, who had woken each morning to warmth in the depths of a brutal frontier winter, would grow up to become a school teacher. She would teach the children of Black Coulee mathematics and science and the importance of precise measurement. The young boy would take over a portion of his father's ranching operation and, in adulthood, would supervise the construction of an even larger vault system that could shelter 120 head of cattle, a scaled-up version of his father's original design. When the bitter winter of 1902 came to the high frontier, that system sheltered animals through a cold that reached -52 degrees Fahrenheit. 0 losses. This is what it meant to survive the frontier. Not through luck, not through the simple accident of having been born with the constitution to endure, but through the willingness to think differently, to measure precisely, to share knowledge freely, and to believe that engineering could meet nature on nature's terms and hold the line. We'll see you at the next warmth.